My husband woke up on Thanksgiving morning to a kitchen so quiet, he told me later, he thought something was wrong with the house before he thought something was wrong with me. No turkey smell. No radio playing low over the sound of a knife on a cutting board. Just a note under a juice glass on the counter, for words long, and a driveway missing one car. By the time his boss arrived for dinner 4 hours later, my husband was standing in that same kitchen in an apron I'd worn for 25 years, trying to figure out which frozen tray went in the microwave first. Before I tell you how I got on that plane, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications, because you'll want to see what he served a billionaire for dinner that year. Tell me in the comments, what's the longest you've ever quietly planned an exit before anyone noticed? Welcome to Revenge Stories Narrated, where family betrayal meets inevitable justice, and karma always collects its debt. My name is Cora. I'm 54, and for 25 Thanksgivings, I cooked a 30-dish feast for my husband Weston's family and whichever corporate guests his career required us to impress that particular year. I trained as a pastry chef in my 20s, ran a small catering business out of a rented commercial kitchen for 3 years before Weston and I married, and gave it up at his mother's suggestion, delivered at our engagement dinner, that a wife in his family's position didn't need to work, a sentence that sounded like a gift for about a decade before I understood it as something else entirely. My mother-in-law, Adeline, has told me for a quarter century that I should wear an apron the entire holiday, stay near the stove, and let Weston's father and whichever executives were visiting that year handle the actual conversation in the dining room, because my presence at the table, unaproned and seated, might read as presumptuous to people whose opinion of Weston mattered more than mine ever seemed to. She always said it while adjusting my apron strings herself, a small, proprietary gesture I came to dread more than the instruction itself. I want to be clear that nobody ever said this cruelly. It was always delivered kindly, almost sweetly, which somehow made it land harder every single year, the way a slow leak does more damage over time than a single flood. The specific costs added up in ways nobody in that family ever had to notice, because I never let them see me add them up. 25 years of a talent I'd trained for professionally, reduced to an unpaid annual performance for people who complimented the food and never once asked who developed the recipe. A dining room chair that was technically mine that I sat in for perhaps 40 total minutes across 2.5 decades of holidays, most years standing at the stove while my own family ate a meal I'd spent 9 hours building. My feet ached in a specific, familiar way for every Thanksgiving afternoon, a pain I'd stopped mentioning to anyone by year 6 because mentioning it had never once changed anything about how the day was structured. A son who, at his engagement dinner 2 years ago, thanked everyone who made tonight special, without once looking toward the kitchen doorway where I happened to be standing at that exact moment, plating dessert, because he'd learned, the way children learn things nobody teaches on purpose, that thanking me publicly wasn't really part of how our family did things. 3 years ago, Weston's company promoted him into a role that put him in regular contact with the company's founder, a specific, exacting man named Aldrich Vane, who Adeline decided almost immediately needed to be dazzled at Thanksgiving every year going forward, a decision that added roughly 8 additional dishes and 1 additional layer of anxiety to a holiday that had never once, in 25 years, actually been mine. This year's dinner had been billed for months as the biggest one yet, 30 dishes, 22 guests, Aldrich Vane attending in person for the first time along with 2 board members Weston was quietly hoping to impress into supporting his own promotion. Adeline called me twice a week for 6 weeks with menu adjustments. I said yes to all of it, calmly, the way I'd said yes to everything for 25 years, and nobody in that house noticed that my calm that particular autumn had a different texture than usual because nobody had ever looked closely enough to know the difference. There had been smaller warnings over the years that I'd let pass, the way you let most things pass when leaving feels harder than staying quiet. 2 Thanksgivings ago, Adeline had asked, in front of guests, whether I'd consider serving in a different blouse next year, something less distracting than the burgundy one I'd worn, a comment delivered with a small laugh that made everyone else laugh too, and that I'd absorbed the way I absorbed most of her comments, filing it somewhere I didn't examine too closely. The year before that, Weston's father had complimented the stuffing directly to Weston, standing 3 feet from me, as though the recipe had simply appeared in the oven on its own. I'd stopped correcting people by year 8 or so. Correcting them had never once changed the following year's dynamic, and eventually the effort itself started to feel like its own kind of exhausting performance. What finally moved something in me wasn't any single comment. It was doing the math one ordinary Tuesday in early October, sitting at my own kitchen table with a legal pad, adding up roughly how many total hours I'd spent on 25 years of Thanksgiving preparation, prep days included, and arriving at a number large enough that I closed the notebook and didn't open it again for a week. When I finally did reopen it, I didn't write another calculation. I wrote a flight search instead. What they didn't know was that I'd spent those same 6 weeks doing something else entirely, quietly, in the specific pockets of time nobody in that family had ever bothered to track, because tracking my time had simply never occurred to them as something worth doing. I opened a savings account they didn't know about, funded slowly from small amounts I'd been setting aside from the grocery budget for years, money that had technically always been mine to manage and had never once been questioned as long as the receipts added up. I booked a first-class ticket to a small island in the Caribbean, the kind of place with one runway and no interest in anyone's corporate hierarchy. I packed one suitcase, a little at a time, in a garment bag at the back of a closet nobody in that house had opened in a decade. If you've ever quietly built a plan while everyone around you assumed you were simply going along with things as usual, hit like right now. I'd love to know in the comments if you've ever surprised people who genuinely never thought to ask what you were thinking. I left the note under a juice glass because it felt appropriate somehow, small and domestic, the same size as every note I'd ever left for that family reminding them where the extra napkins were. For words, the kitchen is yours. I left before 5 in the morning, before Weston woke, and was somewhere over open water with a glass of champagne by the time his alarm went off, expecting the smell of a turkey that didn't exist. He called 11 times before noon. I know the number because he told me himself, weeks later, in a conversation that had considerably more honesty in it than the previous decade of conversations combined. Adeline apparently arrived at 11, expecting a kitchen in full swing, and found her son standing in an apron in front of an empty refrigerator instead, a scene I'm told she did not handle with anything close to her usual composure. Aldrich Vane and the 2 board members arrived on schedule, at 1, to a dining room with no smell of food anywhere in the house and a very quiet, very pale host trying to explain, without quite explaining, why there wasn't a Thanksgiving dinner happening. Weston drove to 3 different grocery stores that were open for exactly 4 hours on the holiday before finding one with a shelf of frozen dinners still stocked. He served Aldrich Vane a microwaved turkey tray with a side of instant mashed potatoes on the good china, because at least the china had been left where it always was. He hadn't set a table properly in over 2 decades, and it showed, apparently, in small ways nobody had to point out directly: forks on the wrong side, no water glasses filled, a centerpiece nobody thought to move before serving around it. I'm told Aldrich Vane found the entire situation more interesting than offensive, asked Weston, directly, in front of the board members, where his wife actually was and why a 25-year Thanksgiving tradition had apparently ended that particular morning without warning. Weston did not have a good answer, because there wasn't one that didn't involve admitting exactly what our family had been asking of me for a quarter century. I was on a beach by then, phone off, a margarita within reach, feeling something I hadn't felt on a Thanksgiving in longer than I could accurately calculate. Not triumph exactly. More like the specific relief of finally putting down something heavy you'd stopped noticing you were carrying. I ordered a plate of grilled fish from a small restaurant with sand for a floor and ate every bite of it sitting down at an actual table, which struck me, absurdly, as one of the more remarkable things that had happened to me in years. Weston's promotion didn't come through that cycle. Aldrich Vane, I found out later from a mutual friend, had mentioned to another executive that he found it telling that a man's own household had apparently been running on labor nobody bothered to value, and that he wasn't in a hurry to hand more responsibility to someone who hadn't noticed that in his own home. Adeline hasn't asked me to cook a holiday meal since, not out of grace, but because I told her plainly, the week I came home, that I wouldn't be doing it again, and for the first time in 25 years, nobody in that family tried to talk me out of a decision I'd already made. I started a small catering business again this spring, slow and modest, 3 events a month so far, every dish credited to me by name on the invoice, which still feels strange to see in writing after so many years of not seeing it anywhere at all. I catered a corporate retirement lunch last month for a company 2 buildings down from Weston's office. Unrelated entirely. A coincidence that made me laugh out loud in my own kitchen when I realized it. Weston and I are working through what 25 years actually cost, in the honest, uncomfortable way that takes longer than either of us would like, some weeks better than others, no clean resolution yet, and possibly none coming. I don't know exactly where that ends up. I know exactly where I'm going next Thanksgiving, and for the first time in a long time, that decision belongs entirely to me. If you've ever given decades of invisible work to people who only noticed once it stopped, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next.